here. The second one, let's think of it like this. If you are a naturalist, you'll also very likely be a materialist about human beings. You'll think human beings are material objects. You won't think that human beings have an immaterial soul or self, or that a human being is an immaterial self or mind. You'll think a human being is a material object. Well, now, from that point of view, what sort of thing would a belief be? We do have beliefs. What kinds of things are these beliefs? What would be their, you might say, what is their makeup? What are they made of? What are they like? Well, the only real possibility one can think of here is that beliefs would be something like long-standing structures or events in one's nervous system, in one's brain, for example, or some other part of one's nervous system. So a belief would be like a whole bunch of neurons working together, a collected bunch of neurons in a kind of structure. And such a thing, if it's a belief, then will have two kinds of properties. There'll be two kinds of things you can say about it, two kinds of attributes. On the one hand, it'll have neurophysiological or electrochemical properties, right? Properties that specify how many neurons there are in this particular structure, and what the rate of fire in the various parts of the structure of the neurons, what this rate of fire is, and how these neurons are related to each other, how they are connected with each other, and how they're also connected to other such structures, or how they're also connected to muscles, so that they can send electrical impulses down chains of neurons, cords of neurons, which would be nerves, to muscles, causing muscular contraction and therefore behavior. All right? These would be electrochemical or neurophysiological properties of a belief, of a structure of that sort, which is what a belief is, a neural structure or event, long-standing event. One kind of property. But if this thing is really a belief, if the structure is a belief, then it's got to have another quite different kind of property. It has to be the belief that P, for some proposition P, it has to have a certain content. It has to be related to a certain proposition in such a way that it's the belief that that proposition is true. So maybe the proposition is that something like there once was a brewery where the Metropolitan Opera House now stands. That would have to be the content. That would be the content of a certain belief, the belief which was the belief that once there was a brewery where the Metropolitan Opera House now stands. All right? So two quite different kinds of properties, neurophysiological properties on the one hand, and this content property on the other hand. A belief then will have both these two kinds of properties. And the second of these four possibilities can be stated like this. Beliefs do cause behavior. After all, a belief would be a neurological structure that sends electrical impulses, messages you might call them, down the nerves to behavior. Down the nerves to muscles, causing muscular contraction and therefore behavior. They do cause behavior, all right, contrary to the first possibility, but it's only by virtue of those neurophysiological properties or electrochemical properties, only by virtue of those properties, not by virtue of the content properties, all right? Now, what is this by virtue of stuff, you might say? Well, don't have time to go into this very deeply, but you might think about a rock or a ball that hits a window and causes it to break. This ball may very well have lots of different kinds of properties. It might be Sam's favorite baseball. It might have the property of having been made in a certain factory. It might have existed for a certain length of time. But it's none of those properties don't have anything to do with its breaking the window. The properties by virtue of which it breaks the window would be properties like its mass and its hardness, its density, the velocity with which it hits the window, and the like. So that illustrates this point about how an object can cause something to happen by virtue of some of its properties, but not by virtue of other of its properties. Some of its properties are relevant to the causal activity there, and other properties are not. Now, the second suggestion here is that beliefs do cause behavior, but only by virtue of those neurophysiological properties, not by virtue of their content. And here too, in this case too, the probability of R is going to be fairly low, because evolution can modify beliefs and belief-producing processes in the direction of greater fitness, but in so doing, there'd be no particular probability at all that it would be modifying their contents as well in the direction of greater truth or greater reliability on the part of the structures that produce these beliefs. Well, next there's a third possibility. I think we'll just skip that one for now. And then a fourth possibility. This is that the beliefs of these hypothetical creatures cause their behavior by virtue of content as well as neurophysiological properties, and are also adaptive. What is the probability here on this possibility that their cognitive faculties are reliable? Well, here I'd have to say not as high as you might think. Beliefs don't causally produce behavior just by themselves. It's beliefs and desires and other factors that do so together. And the problem then is that there will be any number of different patterns of belief and desire for a given action that will issue in that same action. And among those, there will be many in which the beliefs are wildly false. So imagine that Paul is a prehistoric hominid. The exigencies of survival call for him to display tiger avoidance behavior. That just means there's a tiger after him. There will be many behaviors that are appropriate, fleeing, for example, one way to get away from a tiger, climbing a steep rock face, assuming that tigers aren't that great at rock climbing, crawling into a hole too small to admit the tiger, this is a large tiger, or leaping into a handy lake. Now, when I wrote this, I was under the impression that tigers, like house cats, don't like water and wouldn't, leap into a lake after you, but in fact that turns out to be false. So scrub that one. If a tiger's after you, don't try to get away by leaping into a handy lake. Bad idea. All right? Okay, well now take any such appropriate behavior like running away, climbing the rock face. Paul engages in this behavior B, we think, because, sensible fellow that he is, he has an aversion to being eaten, and he believes that B is a good means of thwarting the tiger's intentions. Now, my point here is that there are lots of different belief-desire pairs that will lead to the same action. So here are some sort of fanciful suggestions of other belief-desire pairs that will lead to the same action. So clearly this avoidance behavior could result from 1,000 other belief-desire combinations. Perhaps Paul very much likes the idea of being eaten, but when he sees a tiger, he always runs off looking for a better prospect because he thinks it's unlikely that the tiger he sees will eat him. This will get his body parts in the right place as far as survival is concerned without involving much by way of true belief. Or perhaps he thinks the tiger is a large, friendly, cuddly pussycat and wants to pet it, but he also believes that the best way to pet it is to run away from it. We used to have a cat like that. If you would walk towards it or run towards it would run away. But if you would walk away from it, then it would follow you. Or perhaps he thinks the tiger is a regularly recurring illusion, and hoping to keep his weight down, has formed the resolution to run a mile at top speed whenever presented with this illusion. Or perhaps he thinks he's about to take part in a 1,600-meter race. He wants to win, and he believes the appearance of the tiger is a starting signal. Or perhaps, ... where the idea of the dots is that you can think of lots of different combinations, belief-desire combinations, that would subtend or lead to the very same action here of running away. So there are any number of belief and desire systems that equally fit a given bit of behavior. So what's the probability then on this fourth suggestion that R is true, N and E together with a fourth suggestion? Well, it's not terribly high. I don't know just what to say it is, but it's not terribly high. In the other two cases, I could say the probability is low. Here, all I'll say is it's not terribly high. So trying to combine these probabilities then for these four cases in an appropriate way, it would be reasonable to suppose that the probability of R, of these creatures' cognitive faculties being reliable, is relatively low. somewhat less than a half. All right? So now return to Darwin's doubt. The reasoning that applies to these hypothetical creatures, of course, so far we've been talking about these other creatures that we've been hypothesizing. The reasoning that applies to these hypothetical creatures, of course, also applies to us. So if we think the probability with respect to them is relatively low on N and E, we should think the same thing about the probability of R with respect to us. Something like this reasoning, I think, is what underlay Darwin's doubt. So we should think that P of R on N and E for us is low. All right? That's the first premise of the argument then. P of R on N and E is low. And next I want to argue this.